Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's program. My name is Selma Porcha, and I am the Executive Director of the Congress of Bosniaks of North America, a national, independent, nonpartisan organization whose mission it is to enrich active citizenship of Bosniaks in North America through community empowerment, activism, leadership, preservation of heritage, and remembrance. It is my absolute pleasure and privilege to welcome Robert McNeil to today's program, focused on his new book, Gray Faces, a forensic technician's story of gathering evidence of genocide in Bosnia. Robert, welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Selma. It's an absolute honor to be speaking to yourself and to people from the United States.
Robert McNeil had a 40-year career in pathology in Scotland. In 1996, he volunteered to travel to Bosnia and Herzegovina on behalf of Physicians for Human Rights and the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, to help gather evidence against suspected perpetrators indicted of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. As a forensic technician, he gathered evidence until 2001 from the victims' bodies from hundreds of mass graves around Srebrenica and other parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, and Kosovo. He carried out similar work in Africa, Thailand, Ireland, and France. In 1999, he was honored with an MBE by Prince Charles, the third highest ranking order of the British Empire, awarded for an outstanding achievement of service to the community, which has had a long-term significant impact. Robert is also an author, artist, activist, an ambassador of Remembering Srebrenica, and as of this past Friday, a patron of the Bosnia and Herzegovina UK network. Robert's book, Gray Faces, was published by Bedأt Publishing just ahead of the 27th anniversary of the Srebrenica genocide. All proceeds from the sale of the book will be donated to the Association of Women Victims of War in Sarajevo. This year, it is 27 years since 8,372 men and boys were systematically murdered in Srebrenica because they were Muslim. Yet bodies are still being found, exhumed, identified, and buried. A process Robert was part of starting in 1996. Last week, 50 more victims were laid to rest in Srebrenica. Watching families mourn and finally get closure is an overwhelmingly emotional experience. So are the weeks leading up to and following July 11th each year. Robert, thank you once again for being with us today. I know you have a very busy schedule this time of year, given your role as ambassador of Remembering Srebrenica in the UK, who this year alone organized over 1,000 Srebrenica commemoration events across the country. As someone who's been intimately close to this worst kind of human tragedy, how has the last 10 days been for you?
Well, thank you, Selma. Over the last 10 days has been a great deal of mixed emotion. I felt it was wonderful to catch up with old forensic friends, and also more importantly, some people that I had worked with during the 90s, survivors from the genocide and from their families. But also each year we meet new survivors who have been given the bodies of their loved ones returned to them for burial, and some of them come across to the United Kingdom to speak about their stories of how they lost their loved ones, and so talking to them myself brings back real memories of my time in Bosnia. And just recently I was speaking to second generation Muslims from Srebrenica and other areas around Potocari, who were very anxious to know what had happened to their grandparents, because sometimes their parents don't like to talk about it, and so they wanted some more detail about what happened to their loved ones. And although the work that I did, wasn't pleasant and not pleasant to talk about it, I felt a sense of not gratitude, that would be too strong, but certainly relief, perhaps, that they were getting a tiny bit more of the story of what happened to their grandparents. And importantly, they seemed to take comfort from the fact that the experts who were out there cared for their loved ones. They took good care of them and gave them all the respect that they deserved. And before they were finally identified and handed back for decent burials. And so that gave me a good deal of satisfaction as well.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I think I definitely got that from your book, the immense respect for the dead that you all had on site, and especially you, Robert. You know, it comes across in the book that this was really important to you, that this was someone's loved one that you were taking care of, and each body was treated with respect. And you said that you had connected, you know, you couldn't help but connect with each of the victims. And I think that was, you know, a statement to your character. So let's talk about the book. You were supposed to go to Rwanda, and then you get a call from the ICTY about a change of plans, and you're being sent on a kind of secretive mission to Bosnia. Tell our audience a little bit about what's going through your mind. What is your reaction?
Well, it was actually Physicians for Human Rights that contacted me initially to ask to go to Rwanda, and I was very keen to go out there. It was in fact my first mission abroad, and but as I was ready to go, I'd had my visas and all my medication, etc., sorted out, when I received a call from ICTY to ask instead if I would travel to Bosnia, because they had discovered through aerial photography disturbed earth around the Srebrenica area. That's because 8,500 men and boys had completely disappeared. They wondered if perhaps those people had been killed and buried in those mass graves, as was the case. And so I joined the first of many international forensic teams in a place called Kalisha, where we set up a temporary mortuary near one of the graves and began to prepare for receiving the bodies from the gravesite.
So you arrive in Zagreb, and after some negotiations, you finally get a ride from the UN to Tuzla, right? You're headed to Tuzla. And on your way, you see something pretty terrible. And I think this is something that most Bosnians are familiar with. They've heard these stories. Some of them have witnessed them themselves. Tell our audience a bit about what you saw. I think it was so impactful for me, the way that you talked about that. So I wanted you to share that.
Well, at that time in 1996, there was still a flight ban on flights into Bosnia. And so we had to beg a lift from the UN to take us down overland from Zagreb to Tuzla. And as soon as we crossed into Bosnia, there were clear signs that there had been terrible events going on there. You know, buildings had been destroyed, and many homes had the roofs missing. But apparently, we learned from our driver that the Serbs would turn the gas on and then throw in grenades to ensure that the building would be uninhabitable. But at one point, we stopped at a gas station to fill up on this long journey, and the driver pointed out to I noticed a sharpened pole stuck in the ground and some stains beneath it, and I asked the driver what that might be, and he explained to me that Muslims had been impaled on these poles as a message to refugees not to go any further or go into their town or village. And that was the first of many shocks that we received. As we travelled further and deeper into Bosnia, we saw many mosques that had been completely destroyed, and began to see hundreds of refugees trying to find either get back to their own homes or find somewhere new to live, because, as you know, the ethnic cleansing that began in 1992 caused so much disruption. People were thrown out their homes and couldn't get out of Bosnia because of the flight ban, and so we're going around in circles, and so often Muslims were ethnically cleansed more than once. Just when they thought they'd found somewhere safe, they were kicked out again. And so when we arrived in Tuzla, for the first night we spent in our headquarters. It was just a house that they had rented. And immediately after that, the following day, we were billeted with families. I was fortunate to live with or stay with a mother and daughter in their new home, because they had been ethnically cleansed and found another place in Tuzla.
Yeah. So you arrive. The first mortuary you worked in 1996 gets dubbed the Body Factory. Can you describe the location to our audience so that they know, they have an image of where you're at?
Yes, well, the UN had to set up some place for us to carry out the forensic work. There already had been an advanced party who had gone down there, established that the graves contained bodies, and they tried to find as a temporary mortuary as close as possible to receive the victims' bodies. And the place they found was a bombed out garment factory, which turned out to be a really grim place. There was rubble all over the place, and we had to clear all that away before setting up a workflow for the police, for the radiographer, for the anthropologists, and for the pathologists and technicians to work in. And as I say, it was a grim place, and we had to eat in that place as well, because although Dayton had finally stopped the war, allegedly, there was still sporadic fighting going on around towns and villages and so on. And so we were often interrupted mainly by media, because it was a huge international story when they discovered the bodies. But also we were sent threats by people in whose interests it would be that we didn't continue the work. And at one point we had to abandon the mortuary. It was a very unhygienic place because, as I say, people had to, eat there, and disease became a problem. Dysentery broke out, and so people went down with that. And we were in an area where, for everyone, there was no running water, or electricity was sporadic, and there certainly wasn't much in the way of medical care, not just for the people in Bosnia, but for the teams as well. So it was difficult, and I think after that, the UN decided that it wasn't acceptable to use that place. They used it for a whole season, and then they found another place in Visoko.
So as you receive your first briefing, you're told, and I quote, your job is to provide the forensic evidence that will be needed at the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague, which will convict and punish the indicted perpetrators of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and possibly genocide, end quote. They further tell you that you have to, quote, ensure the evidence is incontrovertible, unbiased, and to the highest professional standards, unquote, which is why they were very careful when picking the experts. And so that means, Robert, that you among the rest of your team as well, were kind of the cream of the crop. And so given your level of expertise and the mountain of evidence that you collected, how is it that we have seen, or in your opinion, how is it that we have seen a rise in genocide denial?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And genocide denial is one of the main reasons for me writing the book, as well as the glorification of war criminals that's going on in Republika Srpska and in Serbia itself. And I guess that I'm seeing signs already in the Ukraine where denial is starting while the fighting is still going on. And my guess is that will increase once the fighting stops. And I suppose it's a defense mechanism that people take on. It's such an interesting question, and I'm not an expert on it, but I have learned that people, the deniers, will say that well, worse happened to us. I lost my family to the Muslims, or we've got people missing, or women were raped, and so on. And what I would say to that is that, well, that's awful, and I certainly worked occasionally with Serbian victims and Croatian victims and Kosovar victims, and but the cruelty that was levelled against the Muslims from all over Bosnia, not just in Srebrenica, in my opinion, is a personal opinion, was pre-planned. It was sustained continuously, and as I say, the numbers, were just unbelievable, really, of people who were killed, especially in Srebrenica over only a few days and nights, where the killings continued, but also in victims from the concentration camps such as Omarska, Ternopily and Kereterm, where we received, and Luka camp, where we received bodies from there. And once again, it was clear that the victims had been badly beaten and tortured before being killed. And so for denial, whilst I sympathise, I feel that the fact that experts from 32 countries around the world, worldwide, and as you say, Selma, who were at the top of their game, really, and some of those experts, there were a few Serbs, doctors who helped with that work, and anthropologists, and I would say to them, that's why I think that the book in that way, from that point of view, is important, because all of those people surely can't be wrong.
Is that why, as a follow-up question, is that why you describe the process in such a level of detail? Was it to show the extent that you all had to go through to actually come up with this evidence? Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because there's a very detailed breakdown of exactly what you had to do.
Yeah, we were all of the team members were given a briefing, but it was a long briefing at the start of the Srebrenica project, and what was emphasised, it didn't need to be emphasised, to be honest, but what was emphasised was the need for the evidence to be absolutely accurate and irrefutable. But that didn't come as any surprise, especially to the pathologists and the anthropologists, because that's their job at home, and they knew that by carrying out autopsies on cases of homicide at home, that the evidence is going to be challenged. And in the case in Bosnia, especially against the main perpetrators, they could afford the best defence teams possible. If there were any holes in the evidence, they would surely find it. So each victim, the pathologists and anthropologists carried out meticulous examinations and doubled up on them by getting colleagues to come along and verify what they had found. And this, of course, it became a problem in a way, because there were more bodies coming in than the teams could handle, and there was some pressure for people to carry out the autopsies more quickly. And I must say that every pathologist, certainly that I worked with, ignored that and carried on and did exactly what they did at home until they were satisfied that what they had found was completely accurate. And that's why, in fact, after that first deployment to Bosnia, when I returned home after 6 weeks or 5 weeks, whatever it was, I felt that I hadn't really done much at all, because of the interruptions, because of the nature of the post-mortem examinations. But what I did feel that it was so important was that we had learned so very much on that first deployment about the process and the workflow and so on. We spent a lot of time putting that together and then trying to ensure that it would be implemented again the following year, because I had decided to return again. And that would save us inventing the wheel again, where people would want to do it their own way. Because it's not a criticism of pathologists, but these experts were very eminent and led in their own universities or departments at home, and they were very used to getting their own way, and they tried perhaps because they did understand the nature of the work, but they wanted to use their process instead of using the international process that they work to at home, and that included the use of language, because the UN decided that they wanted the reports to be in English rather than American English or some other English, and it takes them a wee while to adjust to that. But I would say that by the time we returned the following year, things were in place at least to carry on with the work at a much faster, not faster rate, but get through the postmortems much more quickly by increasing the teams.
So speaking of the experts and their level of expertise, I'm from Seattle, and I couldn't help but notice that a member of the forensics team was Bill Haglund, right? He was the infamous medical investigator who worked with the Seattle Police Department on the Green River serial murders. And so he was literally a legend.
Yes.
Given that you and the teams were the best of the best, and you clearly came up with the evidence to for the court to rule that Srebrenica was a genocide. What do you say to people who, we talked a little bit about denial, but there's these statements that they make every year when there's the burial. They say that empty coffins are being buried, right? What do you say to those people? I mean, this is a process that many people could negate if it was really empty coffins, right?
Oh yeah. No, there's no doubt about that at all. Excuse me, the Bill Haglund, just excuse me a second, we get a drink of water. Yes, Bill Haglund indeed was a legend back in Seattle, and he became one in Bosnia as well. Bill worked out actually physically at the grave sites, not only helping with the exhumations, but finding new graves, and he would stay overnight in those graves that hadn't been secured by the military, trying to protect them. And I got on extremely well with him, because when he first came to the house that we use as our HQ, I was introduced to him, and he smiled and said, "Oh, another tech," and he explained that that's how he started in a mortuary in Seattle. And because there were long spells where nothing much was happening, he'd pick up a book and read about forensic work and studied bones, etc. And the rest is history. Became a world famous anthropologist, and so I got on very well with him, and it was a privilege to work with him and the many other anthropologists from North America and from South America, because so many of those experts had massive experience themselves in South America during the juntas that went on in the 60s and 70s, and they were a great asset and taught Europe really about forensic anthropology. But as far as the continuing denial is concerned, I'm not often given an opportunity personally to challenge it. And going back to the book, that's perhaps maybe if some deniers were to read it, if they wanted to, maybe, just maybe, they might think twice about their denial and as I said earlier, the glorification of war criminals, because what they perhaps don't understand is the hurt that causes the families of the survivors, that are being so badly disrespected. And I remember on a trip to Bosnia, back to Potocari, where the cemetery is, asking one of the mothers there, do you forgive the men who did this? And she said to me something that stuck with me, which was, well, we've never been asked for forgiveness, so how can we possibly forgive until that happens? And I don't know how long it's going to take, and I don't know what it will take for those perpetrators or their families to get over their reasons for denial. Because, as I say, the defence of those main war criminals was at its peak, and they couldn't prove or disprove the charges that was levelled against them, or the verdicts.
So, coming back to the mortuary, the body factory. There was a term that everyone used, the gray mud. Upon realizing what the gray mud was, I was in shock. Can you tell our audience a little bit about what that is? I know it's not a friendly sight, but I think it's important for people to know.
Yes, well, in the temporary mortuary and around the grave sites, the brown mud turns a horrible grey colour because the bodies were decomposed very badly from the start after the men and boys were murdered, and so getting the bodies out of the graves, they were in a very poor state, and so the mud was tramped into, the people were tramping mud into the ground. It turned grey. The smell that went with it, I don't suppose anyone having been involved in that situation would ever forget the smell. I was kind of used to it because didn't deal at home with mass deaths, but certainly decomposed bodies was something that I had seen before. But yes, it was a depressing place. I think that when going to work, when walking through the compound, through the mud, if it rained, it was much worse. And got that together with the smell gave this sense of gloom from the moment you arrived. It stayed with you until we left, and there were long working days. We were working sometimes for 12 hours, and by the time we got back to where we lived, it was a great relief to smell fresh air once again.
And on top of that, you didn't have running water, right? For
yes.
the most part. So you've got this gray mud, which is filled with decomposing human remains.
Yeah.
It stays on you because you're unable to wash it because you don't have running water. So I just kept imagining what that was like, and I couldn't imagine it. So thank you for sharing that. I know it's not a pleasant thing to talk about. You explain in the book that Srebrenica, was a safe area, but in fact, it ended up being, like many of the other safe areas in the country, the most dangerous place in the world. You kind of talk about this in the book, but I was hoping you would maybe share also with the audience why you think that happened, based on kind of how you explained it in the book. Why did the international community and the UN fail in protecting the people? What happened?
No, that's a very important question, Selma. Safe area, the term itself is really meaningless. And I learned that there were many meetings in the UN to figure out how to term these areas, because sanctuary or safe haven were the obvious ones when they decided to create these 6 areas in Bosnia where refugees and people who'd been ethnically cleansed could head to, because as I said earlier, with the air embargo, people couldn't get out of the country. As you know, it's surrounded by Croatia and Serbia. There's only one tiny port, but I don't think they have a harbour there. And so the people, I suppose the UN decided that we had to do something. And so they come up with this term safe area without actually explaining it, other than to encourage people, the Muslim people to head there. And so the town of Srebrenica, which had, I believe, a population of around 7,000 or so Muslims, soon grew to over 30,000. All of them packed into the town. It's not a huge sized town. Many of them had to sleep in the street. There was nowhere for them to live. And bearing in mind that the Serbs had immediately surrounded all of those so-called safe areas, and began a siege that lasted 3 years. And it was the same in Sarajevo, and I believe in the other safe zones or whatever. And people were, the population were being sniped and shelled, and mortar shells are landing almost every day. But what I think, the big misunderstanding is that the Muslims believed that the UN, the Dutch UN troops, were there to protect them. And from reading about it at the time, because it puzzled me how they could all be, just killed like indiscriminately like that. And from what I've read, it appears that they didn't have a mandate to fight Serbs. And the reasoning behind that was that if they did, it could spark a war between Serbia and the UN, which may have brought in the Russians who backed Serbia. And so my understanding is that the mandate they had was to report what was happening, but also to send in humanitarian aid to those areas for the people who were trapped there. But they failed miserably with that as well, because aid convoys would get sent out. The Serbs would stop the trucks many times, demanding to inspect them in case, as they said, there might be weapons concealed in them. And they charged a price for that, and that price was to remove a third of the contents of the essential medical aid and food. And this would happen more than once, so that by the time the trucks reached Srebrenica, there was very little left for the population. They tried airdrops. That wasn't a great success either, because people were actually killed by the crates that had been dropped from the sky when they ran to try and get some food. And of course, they came under fire from the Serbs, and the Serbs got many of that aid as well. So the UN were in effect feeding the Serb army, although it wasn't deliberate, obviously. But that made it so much more hell for the population there. And bear in mind too that although supposedly over 8,000 were executed, there were people dying during the siege of starvation. They endured at least 2 winters, and winters, you'll know, in Bosnia can be very, very cruel. And so I'm sure that some of the bodies that we discovered may well have been those people who had died, and they were just thrown in the graves along with the executed men.
So you dealt with both primary and secondary mass graves. And when you described the process in your book, it was like an enormous puzzle, because sometimes body parts were found miles apart. Without DNA sampling, which I think wasn't done until later on in Visoko. How did you manage to piece it all together? How do you put together this puzzle of a human body?
Yeah, well, that would be down mainly to the superb anthropologists who were there. But I think it's important, if you don't mind, I'll just explain the difference between the primary and secondary graves, because this was this news that we received. We began to hear rumours in '97, but it came to fruition in '98, when we had heard these rumours that they were finding the primary graves had been re-entered by the Serbs over the winter. That those graves hadn't been secured by the military at that time. And so the bodies were taken out, and it was a puzzle because we couldn't understand that until we started finding bodies in secondary graves. But it wasn't whole bodies that was being discovered. It was body parts, and I describe in the book, and it's pretty horrible, the way the bodies were torn apart and dumped in different graves further into Republika Srpska. But the thing that I think we were all affected by was, as well as the fact that instead of 8,500 bodies we were to deal with, that became 17,000 body parts we were faced with trying to put together again. But worse than that, I think, Selma, was that news totally devastated the families of those waiting for news of their loved ones, because both they and us knew that this job was going to take an awful lot longer than it did. DNA matching was around at the time, but it was extremely expensive, and it took a long time. It would have to, have to be sent abroad. But what we started to do was to take samples of DNA from bones and store them. I think it was Bill Clinton, in fact, in the UK government and others who established the DNA Centre in Sarajevo for ICMP, the International Commission on Missing Persons. And that place, I have visited it, it became the gold standard of DNA matching, because they were able to create almost a conveyor belt, if you like, to be able to make matches quickly, far more quickly than anywhere else. And so that process, it was so important for the quicker identification of the victims. Excuse me, because my heart sank when I returned that first time to Visoko in 1997. I had asked how many bodies had been identified, and my driver told me seven people identified. But that quickly increased with the numbers of experts that came, the process of DNA matching in Sarajevo, and that meant that we were returning bodies to the authorities, who could then find the relatives and give the bodies back to them. But the work of piecing together the bones was absolutely amazing. I mean, there were experienced anthropologists and pathologists to a certain extent as well, because as we continued with the work into later years, what we were finding mostly was just bones. The fleshed bodies had, had decomposed to the point it was bones, and so the anthropologists became the real stars. And I worked very closely with them in laying out the body parts and so on. So that was how it was done.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I mean, I knew that you had a very important role in all of that, and you. At one point talk about, having to boil human bones. When I read that on the page, I was just like, oh my goodness. I understand from reading in the book why it had to be done, but can you share with the audience why you would have to do such a thing that sounds so horrendous?
Yeah, well, that was done again by the anthropologists, and what they needed to do, although they were mainly skeletons, to establish a report on what had happened to those bodies, the bones needed to be clean. They had to be free of human tissue, and it sounds terrible, but what I will say is that once the bones were cleaned and laid out, and every time we got a full body back together again, because if you remember, there were so many body parts coming from all over the place. Up to one case, I was working there when body parts from 5 separate graves of one individual came in, and so when we had a body complete, I wouldn't call it a celebration, but there was great relief that they knew that family were given back a body to bury. And when you try to visualize what those bodies were like in the mass graves, torn apart, all commingled and so on, to be able to have them, what remained of them, to be clean and placed anatomically back together again in a clean, coffin was. I sometimes got a sense of pride seeing those bodies being returned to their families, and I mean, they wouldn't be able to see them, although we were on occasion families did ask to see the bones, and that went totally against the culture of most of us, because we wouldn't allow. Well, we wouldn't say we wouldn't allow it, but the lesson that I learned from that was that I would never say no to a family if they were desperate to see whatever, because what they saw was not what we saw.
So you also describe in some of the mass graves, you found fragments of nearby mosques that had been demolished. and then, you know, they would throw the bodies in, and then they would throw the rubble from the mosque in, and it was a symbolic gesture, if you will, of the Bosnian Serbs of burying the Muslim faith.
Yeah.
But this kind of awful, not all kind of, but awful barbaric practice turned out to be useful to you guys. Can you tell the audience a little bit about that?
Yeah, when we reached when the secondary graves were established with the body parts in them, there was because they were dug up using, you know, mechanical diggers, etc., and so they took a lot of the surrounding earth with them, and they just emptied them onto trucks, took them away to the next grave. But in those shovelfuls of not just human remains were various artifacts, some that belonged to people, but also, as you mentioned, the tiles, the little square tiles that were used to build the mosques. And we had an expert in who would be able to establish where exactly that mosque had come from, and therefore possibly where some of the victims had come from as well. So as well as gathering up the do beg your pardon, as well as gathering up the bones, we cleaned the debris that come from mosques and stored all of them, and so. But you're absolutely right. The Serbs made a mistake when they thought that they were destroying the culture of the Muslims.
And, you know, not only did you work on identifying victims from mass graves in Srebrenica, but you also, other parts of Bosnia as well, right? Including Omarska camp and others that you named earlier. You know, given the evidence that was collected, why, in your professional opinion, did the courts rule Srebrenica a genocide, but not other parts of Bosnia where we saw similar patterns of mass killings of Muslims? Yeah,
no, that's a great question, and it puzzled myself and others as well when the judgments were made. I have spoken to Bosniaks who felt really let down when the judgments were passed, but and all I said to them was that, you know, to prove genocide is the most difficult crime to prove ever, really. And most of the men who were charged with genocide and the cases weren't proven, were charged with, you know, the next worst crime that man can make, and that's crimes against humanity, which before the Second World War was the most, the biggest charge that you could level against anyone. But that still didn't satisfy the families from around the Prijedor area and other parts of Bosnia. So it's a difficult one. I'm not a lawyer. I remember at the time when the judgment of genocide was made for Srebrenica and to some extent Sarajevo, I read that the judges would explain their reasoning at a later date. I haven't found that on the ICTY website yet, but I hope they carry that through and be able to give a satisfactory explanation, about that judgment, because I can categorically say that, you know, the flesh bodies, when I say that, bodies who, you know, had some state level of decomposition, had a lot of flesh in them, and you could fairly easily establish what had occurred to them, the tortures, the clubbings and the stabbings, and then of course the shootings. In Prijedor, especially around the areas where the camps were, those victims' bodies had been in the ground since 1992. And so that was, you know, a good few years before Srebrenica. And so it was really skeletal remains. At the first briefing that we had from the ICTY about what to look for from those graves in Omarska, they were keen to know, for example, there was terrible sexual abuse that had been described by witnesses in court of not only of women but men too, and that was very difficult for the pathologist often to establish, because they were really dealing with bones from the victims' bodies, and so. But they were able to establish causes of death through analysing the skeletons.
Yeah, and that was exactly why I asked the question. Was, apart from the legal argument, right, which was left to the legal team, you guys did the work of gathering the evidence, and you were witness to what had taken place in Srebrenica, and if there were any similarities, right, to what was taking place in Bedăt and other places. And so, it's definitely a puzzle. A lot of people have this question still, and hopefully we will have an answer that would be kind of closure to why. But a lot of people feel that an injustice has been done, right, because of the fact that due to maybe not as many people having been killed, or whatever people are thinking is the excuse or the reason, that it wasn't, the same at the same level as Srebrenica. But anyways, that was why I was curious about this, was from an evidence gathering perspective.
But if I could just add that the reasons that the judgments were made about, for example, the concentration camps, was because there were many witnesses that could attest exactly to what happened to the victims before they were killed. And so I guess, and this is I guess, the courts were basing their judgments on those witness statements. But what they probably may not have been able to do is to prove that it was systematic, that it was pre-planned. And as you know, genocide has to prove it, you have to prove that there has to be a paper chain, there has to be a paper trail, and in order to convict. And that, I'm sure, was true of Srebrenica, but maybe there wasn't that paper trail in the camps. So one of my colleagues at CBNA, the Congress of Bosniaks in North America, spoke to a man who was a director at the International Commission of Missing Persons. And he had told them about a case of one of the exhumations where they found bones that they couldn't ID. And the case was unsolved for a while. And eventually they were able to determine that the DNA of a son matched that of his father, who was killed and buried in the same mass grave, except 50 years earlier during World War II. Given that Eastern Bosnia was a place of mass atrocities during World War II as well, during your work, were there any examples where the exhumated remains belonged to people who were murdered during World War II, or did you never come across them? Certainly not in my time there, Selma. I think that all of the graves that I was involved in, or all the victims from those graves, were all killed between 1991 and 1995. They were new graves, if you like. And it's very interesting to hear what the lady or gentleman from ICMP said. And if I could just once again pay tribute to ICMP, they have carried out. Our job was mainly collecting evidence. We did that. But we also tried to retain anything that might help in future identifications, and that was like through clothing, etc. But when ICMP took over the exhumations, they still continue to do that to this day, of course, not only in Bosnia but in different parts of the world, and pay a great tribute to the people from ICMP who do a fantastic job.
You went back to Bosnia 5 times, working in really awful conditions. And when I say that, I mean, what you were dealing with was mentally, physically exhausting. Why did you keep going back? In the book you explain it, and I know, but I would like for you to share with the audience sort of what kept bringing you back to Bosnia.
Yes, well, there were a couple of things, simple things, like I would receive a phone call during the winter and say, right, we want you to go back next year. And each time I finished a deployment, I can say, not ashamed to say it, but I felt, that's it, I've had enough, I don't want to do this anymore. But then when I got home, it was really difficult to get Bosnia out of my mind. in those days, because of various confidentiality documents we had to sign, I didn't talk to anyone about it, and it didn't appear to me that many people were that interested anyway. But during the time when I returned home and decided to go back again, I just felt this continuous bad feeling about not doing enough. You know, I knew the bodies were piling up. I would hear reports from colleagues who had carried on where I left off, and the camaraderie between the team members. You know, some of us returned time and again, and part of the reason was to, you know, catch up with them again, and didn't want to let them down. But also the stories. I formed relationships, close friendly relationships with some of the local Bosniaks, especially the people that I lived with, and before I left, each time they would say, "Are you coming back?" And I would believe I would be telling them a lie when I said, "Yes, of course I'll come back," thinking, "No, I don't, maybe not." But I felt compelled to return there too, because there was this great sense I felt from the Bosniaks, the Muslims, that we had let them down in the past. You know, and it's true that the Western governments, they didn't ignore it, but they couldn't find solutions to stop what was happening. And I felt personally that at least if I gave some people a sense that we did care about them, and we did try to give them back their loved ones for you know, to have a decent and dignified burial, then I went back again and again, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting watching you make those decisions, or I guess imagining you make those decisions as I'm reading your book, because like you said, at the end of every deployment, you're just so exhausted and you can't wait to be back in your bed, and, you know, in your shower, and all these kind of, you know, everyday conveniences that we're used to. But then, you know, you get the call, and you could say no, right? You could say, "No, I'm good, I'll pass," right? And yet you kept going back. And so that was interesting to me. And again, thank you for doing what you did. I think it was incredibly important. You mentioned a few times in the book that this war will never be over. And it wasn't your words, it was words of other people that you had spoken to in the book. I've heard these words myself. They were spoken last week by an elderly man who finally buried his son 27 years after they found his remains. And we, you know, saw tensions rising in Bosnia again when Dodik threatened to secede the entity of Republika Srpska from the rest of Bosnia again. So here we are kind of on this precipice again of talking about it all over again. You know, you've now been doing this advocacy and activism work for many, many years. What, in your opinion, what is missing? What do we need to do to ensure that the war does end, and that never again means exactly that? You know, I know it's a personal opinion sort of question, but I'd really like to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think perhaps one of the depressing features of what you've just described, Selma, is the fact that children in schools in Republika Srpska and Serbia and in Kosovo, the children are taught two versions of the history, and that may well be an additional element to the denial that's going on, because, you know, they believe what their teachers tell them, and so without them knowing too much about it personally, because it didn't affect them so much, they believe that what they're saying is true. And you're right. I did say that so many people I spoke to would, as you say the war will never end, and you know, there is a history of conflict in Bosnia and the former Yugoslavia, but I just felt very strongly when I tried to learn more about it that the war that was created by Milosevic in Bosnia was a war of aggression. It's been described even to this day as a civil war, you know, implying that both sides were equal in it, and somebody won, somebody lost. But But from my own personal experience out there, I feel I know that this was a war against a people using religion as a tool in order to justify it to the people that were fighting it. And so I'm not optimistic about the future based on what I've seen. And of course, you mentioned the Ukraine at the beginning. We're seeing again for different reasons, I guess. But the same thing where power becomes, the main feature, and that certainly was what was in Milosevic's mind and why he created 4 wars in the former Yugoslavia before the Bosnian people, the Serbians, got sick of him, and it was taken to the Hague in handcuffs, and that's something that for me was maybe a great joy in the sense that sooner or later these people face the consequences of their actions. But that doesn't answer the question about education, and because of the political setup in Bosnia with the 3 presidencies and so on. I don't know. You'll know better than I guess, how to resolve the education issue. But I think that must be the root of it. And I should say also that it's not all Serbs feel that way. There are Serbs who feel very badly about what happened in Bosnia, and so I hope that messages can come from Serbians to other Serbians and those who would gain from these horrors to try and have a means of telling the truth, the true truth, if you like, about what happened, and to try and move on. Going back to what I said about the mothers, where she said, until we ask forgiveness, how can we forgive?
There has to be an admittance, right, of fault. There has to be a process of understanding you did something wrong and asking and repenting, right, and then asking for that forgiveness in order for that forgiveness to actually happen. Yeah. I cannot thank you enough for all of the work that you have done and continue to do. All of the sacrifices you have made, both personal and professional. The work that you did became part of our history. And although I know it still haunts you, I hope it gives you solace to know that your story will live on. People will learn from it and remember you and all of the forensic technicians who gave voice to the dead and ensured that truth and justice prevail. I want everyone to check out Robert's book, Grave Faces, and don't forget that all of the proceeds from the sale of the book will be donated by Robert to the Association of Women Victims of War in Sarajevo. Robert, is there anything else that you would like to share in closing remarks?
I don't think so. I think you've covered it beautifully, Selma. I'm getting quite old now. When I heard about the war breaking out in the Ukraine, I had this little spark saying, "Oh, I wonder if I'll go there," but that can't happen. I'd like to end on a note of optimism, but I'm struggling just now after our conversation to find one. But I hope that people, by reading the book, will be able to have a better understanding of what the forensic experts did out there, and they'll understand what a technician's job does, because after a trip to Kosovo, this time for the Foreign Office in 1999, the politician who's a minister in the Foreign Office held a reception for the team. It was a British team of forensic specialists, mainly made up of police officers, and he thanked all the people that were involved, including the radiographer, which was very important, the anthropologist, and the police, and the pathologist, and he left me out. And I approached him. I'd had a glass of wine by this time, and I said, "You didn't mention the forensic technicians," and he turned to me and said, "Oh, really? Oh, what is it you did then?" And I just said nothing. So I wanted the book to be able to explain that technicians work extremely closely with pathologists, establishing the causes of death, and they don't get any praise for it, really. But so I'll end on that note.
Yeah, well, you definitely, to me, painted a picture of an extremely important role, without which I think the work couldn't have possibly been done as effectively and as efficiently as it was. And with that, we will end our program. Thank you to our audience for watching.
Thank you.